In the heart of 1930s Chicago, where shadows danced with danger, Salvatore Sal the Serpent Moretti ruled the Gilded Cage, a speakeasy as opulent as it was deadly. His word was law, his reputation forged in unforgiving steel, and his heart a fortress no one had ever breached. But on one rain-slicked night, the carefully constructed order of his empire shattered. A small figure, barely a whisper against the roar of the illicit jazz, burst through the heavy oak doors. Elena Petrova, no older than 10, her eyes wide with a terror that cut through the smoky air, begged for a mercy her hardened world had never offered. Her desperate plea for her ailing mother would soon drag Sal Moretti, the unfeeling king of this criminal dynasty, back into a past he'd meticulously buried, igniting a conflict that threatened to consume everything he'd built. The penthouse office of Salvatore Sal the Serpent Moretti was a sanctuary of polished mahogany and hushed authority, perched high above the grimy streets he commanded. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, each drop a tiny hammer blow against the city's relentless rhythm. Sal sat behind his imposing desk, a man sculpted from granite and shadow. His dark suit was immaculate, the sapphire on his right hand catching the low light like a captive star. The streaks of gray at his temples, a subtle concession to time, did nothing to soften the predatory stillness with which he observed the world. Decades of brutal efficiency had forged him, and the memory of his wife Maria, lost to a stray bullet years ago, was a perpetual ember beneath his icy exterior, a wound he masked with a ruthless refusal of sentiment. Today, however, that carefully constructed fortress was about to be breached by a force far more potent than any rival gang: innocence. A small, disheveled figure stood before him, a child of 7, Elena Petrova. Her dark hair was a tangled mess, her once clean dress smudged with the grime of her journey. But it was her eyes wide, pleading brown pools reflecting a desperation that clawed at something deep within Sal that held him captive. She clutched a worn, folded piece of paper, her knuckles white. The air in the room, usually charged with Sal's controlled menace, felt suddenly thick with a vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Jorge El Martillo Rodriguez, Sal's loyal enforcer, stood by the door, a silent, imposing shadow, his dark eyes missing nothing, his powerful build radiating a controlled strength that was the hammer to Sal's serpent strike. He observed Elena with a guarded neutrality, ready to act on Sal's slightest signal, but even he seemed to sense the unusual gravity of the moment. The usual scent of expensive cigar smoke and stale power in the room was now overlaid with the faint, almost imperceptible scent of damp wool and childlike fear. Elena's small voice, though trembling, cut through the opulent silence like a shard of glass. "Mr. Moretti, please, my mama, she's sick. The men, they took her medicine." She extended the crumpled paper, a hastily drawn picture of a wilting flower, a symbol of her mother's fading health, and a crude drawing of menacing figures. Pulse leaned forward, his cold blue eyes locking onto the child's. The image on the paper, so raw and desperate, was a mirror to a pain he had buried decades ago. Maria, her laughter, her warmth, a stark contrast to the void that had consumed him since her death. He remembered the helplessness, the visceral fury at being unable to protect her, the very vulnerability he had sworn to eradicate by embracing the serpent's cold logic. This child, this fragile messenger, was forcing him to confront the man he had become, a man built on the ashes of his heart. Jorge remained a statue by the door, his expression unreadable, yet a subtle tension in his jaw suggested he understood the shift in the air. He had seen Sal dispense brutal justice, but this was different. It was a crack in the armor, a flicker of the man beneath the myth. Nikolai Volkov, the consigliere, a man whose ancient eyes had witnessed the city's underworld morph through decades, would later deem this moment a dangerous deviation from established order. For Nikolai, sentiment was a liability, a weakness that invited predators. But here, in the sterile grandeur of Sal's office, Elena's simple plea was a force of nature, an undeniable truth in a world built on lies and violence. The debt collectors, crude thugs working for some minor loan shark, had overstepped. They had crossed a line, not just into the Petrova family's desperate life, but into Sal's carefully guarded past. Sal looked from Elena's tear-streaked face to the crude drawing, and then his gaze drifted, as if seeing beyond the rain-streaked glass, to a distant, painful memory. He saw Maria, young and vibrant, caught in a crossfire she never should have been near. The raw, unadulterated grief had hardened him, cementing his resolve to become untouchable, a serpent coiled in its lair, protected by its venom. Sentiment was a luxury he could no longer afford, compassion, a weakness that led to loss. But looking at Elena, a child forced to bear the weight of her mother's suffering, a different kind of fire ignited within him, not the cold fury of vengeance, but the protective instinct he had long suppressed. He stood, his movements fluid and deliberate, the very air around him seeming to thicken. He walked to the window, his back to Elena and Jorge, and stared out at the city lights blurring through the downpour. He was not a protector. He was a kingpin, a man who dealt in fear and control. Yet the image of Elena's pleading eyes, so like Maria's in their helplessness, was a persistent ache. Jorge, Sal's voice was a low rumble, devoid of its usual edge. Find out who's been leaning on the Petrova family. I want names, and the medicine they took. I want it back, discreetly. Jorge nodded, his dark eyes meeting Sal's, in a silent understanding that transcended words. His role was to execute, to be the hammer that crushed opposition. But now the hammer was being directed not just by Sal's will, but by a flicker of something akin to justice, a new directive that prioritized shielding the vulnerable, a path Nikolai Volkov would surely condemn as folly. The old ways, the strict codes of the underworld, were being challenged by a single brave messenger. The air in Salvatore, Sal the Serpent, Moretti's penthouse office, was thick with the scent of expensive cigar smoke and the metallic tang of unspoken power. Sunlight filtered through the reinforced glass that offered a panoramic, almost detached view of the city, glinted off the sapphire on Sal's right hand. He sat behind a massive mahogany desk, a fortress of polished wood, his sharp features a mask of cold calculation, his dark, slicked-back hair showing streaks of gray at the temples, framed eyes that missed nothing, piercing, cold blue irises that had seen too much betrayal, too much loss. Decades ago, the brutal crossfire that claimed his wife Maria had forged the Serpent, hardening him into a man who equated sentiment with weakness. He believed vulnerability was a death sentence, a lesson etched into his soul by the raw agony of that day. His dark eyes, typically unreadable, held a flicker of something uncharacteristic, perhaps concern. He spoke in his usual low, measured tone, but the words carried a weight that made Sal's gaze sharpen. "Boss, there's a kid. Found her at the service entrance. Says she needs to see you. Says her mother is sick." The child, Elena Petrova, a fragile girl of 7, was a stark image of desperation. Her small frame trembled, her once clean dress torn and smudged with dirt. His dark eyes, typically unreadable, held a flicker of something uncharacteristic, perhaps concern. He spoke in his usual low, measured tone, but the words carried a weight that made Sal's gaze sharpen. "Boss, there's a kid. Found her at the service entrance. Says she needs to see you. Says her mother is sick." The child, Elena Petrova, a fragile girl of 7, was a stark image of desperation. Her small frame trembled, her once clean dress torn and smudged with dirt. Wide, pleading brown eyes, tangled dark hair matted with what looked like dried tears, conveyed a profound urgency that pierced through Sal's carefully constructed defenses. She clutched Jorge's leg as if he were the only anchor in a storm. This was not a threat, not a rival, but something far more disarming, innocence in extremis. Elena Petrova's voice, a reedy sound lost in the cavernous office, trembled as she spoke. "Mr. Moretti, please. My mama, she's very sick. The men, they keep coming. They say she owes money, she can't breathe right, and they just shout. Each word was a raw plea, unfiltered by the calculated language Sal was accustomed to. Her small hands, grimy and thin, bored into fists against her tattered dress, as if trying to hold herself together. Her gaze, wide and earnest, was fixed on Sal's face, searching for any sign of understanding, any hint of mercy in the formidable figure before her. Sal's cold blue eyes, usually calculating and detached, flickered with something he hadn't felt in years, a ghost of his own past, of Maria's terror, of the vulnerability he buried so deep. He saw not just a child, but a reflection of a pain he'd sworn to eradicate from his life, and from the lives of anyone who dared to get close. His jaw tightened, the predatory stillness he moved with momentarily faltering. "Who are these men?" he finally rasped, his voice rough, unused to such raw emotional terrain. Jorge stepped forward, his imposing presence a silent promise of protection, yet his gaze remained on Sal's, waiting for a directive. "Collectors, boss," from outside the usual circles, named Silas Thorne. "Aggressive. Don't play by the rules." Thorne's name was a dark whisper on the street, a predator known for his brutality and disregard for established order. This was precisely the kind of chaos Saul loathed, the kind that threatened to unravel the careful balance he'd maintained for decades. He looked at Elena, at the sheer terror etched on her young face, a terror he knew intimately. The memory of Maria, frail and helpless, flashed before his eyes, a wound that never truly healed. He had built walls of ice around his heart, but this small, brave girl was chipping away at them, demanding an answer to a question he'd long ago stopped asking himself. What was the point of power if it couldn't protect the innocent? The weight of the child's plea hung in the air, a heavy counterpoint to the sterile luxury of Sal's office. As Sal's jaw tightened, a voice dry and raspy, like ancient parchment, cut through the tension. "Salvatore, the child speaks of Thorn." Nikolai Volkov, the old guard consigliere, emerged from the shadows near the far wall, his gaunt frame stooped, leaning on a polished wooden cane. His thinning white hair was combed back neatly, his deeply lined face, a roadmap of decades spent navigating the treacherous currents of organized crime. He wore an expensive, if slightly old-fashioned dark suit, a stark contrast to Sal's modern tailoring. Nikolai was the keeper of the old ways, the guardian of the honor and brutal etiquette that had governed their world for generations. He saw the world not in terms of personal salvation, but in terms of established power structures and territorial agreements. He viewed Thorne's aggressive tactics as a dangerous anomaly, a threat to the delicate balance he'd worked so hard to maintain. "Thorne has always been a shark," Nikolai continued, his sharp, intelligent gaze fixed on Sal. "He has no respect for the lines we draw, allowing him to operate like this, preying on the weak. It's an invitation to anarchy. It degrades us all." His words were not just advice, they were a subtle warning. Nikolai understood Sal's past, the tragedy that had forged him, but he also understood the necessity of maintaining a ruthless, detached authority. Sentiment, in Nikolai's view, was a luxury no boss could afford. "This family," Nikolai gestured dismissively with his cane towards Elena, who flinched at his tone. "They are collateral. Thorne is the problem. Focus on him, Salvatore. Do not let a child's tears distract you from the true enemy." Sal's eyes, which had softened almost imperceptibly when looking at Elena, hardened again. He understood Nikolai's logic. It was the logic that had kept him alive, kept him in power. But looking at Elena's tear-streaked face, seeing the echoes of his own buried grief, he felt a deep, unsettling shift within him. The lines Nikolai spoke of were clear, brutal, and absolute. But for the first time in decades, Sal found himself questioning if those lines were as immutable as he had always believed. The city's breath was cold and wet, a relentless autumn rain slicking the narrow alleyways of the Lower East Side. Shadows stretched long and distorted from the flickering neon signs of a distant bar, casting an eerie glow on the overflowing dumpsters and graffiti-scarred brickwork. It was here, amidst the stench of decay and damp concrete, that Elena Petrova, a fragile girl of about 7 years old, found herself making a desperate plea. Her small frame shivered, not just from the biting chill, but from a fear that had been her constant companion for weeks. Her simple, once clean dress, now torn and smudged with the grime of her journey, clung to her thin body. Wide, pleading brown eyes, usually bright with childhood innocence, were now pools of desperation, streaked with tears and dirt. Her dark, tangled hair was plastered to her forehead by the rain. She clutched a worn, handmade doll, its button eyes staring blankly, a silent witness to her plight. She had run from the cramped tenement apartment she shared with her ailing mother, driven by a terror that had finally tipped the scales. The debt collectors, men with faces like granite and voices like scraping metal, had grown bolder, their threats more frequent. Her mother's cough had worsened, each ragged breath a painful reminder of their dwindling time. Elena knew she had to find someone, anyone with the power to stop them, to save her mother. She had heard whispers, hushed conversations in the building's hallway about a man named Salvatore Moretti, a name spoken with a mixture of fear and respect. They called him Sal the Serpent, a man who commanded respect and enforced his will with an iron fist. To Elena, he represented their last, desperate hope. Clutching a crumpled piece of paper, her mother's name and the address of Moretti's dimly lit office, scrawled by a neighbor, she stepped out of the relative shelter of a doorway and into the deluge. The sound of her own ragged breathing was lost in the drumming rain. She had to find him, had to make him listen. Her mother's life, her fragile world, depended on it. The offices of Salvatore the Serpent, Moretti, were a stark contrast to the squalor Elena had just escaped. Located in a discreet, nondescript building in a less frequented part of the city, the interior exuded an aura of quiet, controlled power. The air, thick with the scent of expensive cigar smoke and polished wood, seemed to hum with an unspoken authority. Sal, a man in his late 40s, sat behind a massive mahogany desk, his sharp features and piercing blue eyes missing nothing. His dark, slick-back hair, streaked with gray at the temples, framed a face that was a mask of ruthless efficiency. He was impeccably dressed, as always, in a tailored dark suit, the knot of his Italian silk tie precise. A heavy gold ring, set with a large sapphire, glinted on his right hand as he idly tapped a pen against a leather-bound ledger. His usual demeanor was one of predatory stillness, a coiled readiness that spoke of decades spent navigating and dominating the treacherous landscape of organized crime. His entire existence was geared towards maintaining absolute control, preserving his empire, and shielding himself from the vulnerability he'd experienced years ago when his wife Maria was lost to senseless violence. Sentiment, he'd long decided, was a fatal weakness. But as Jorge El Martillo Rodriguez, his loyal enforcer, entered the room with a hesitant, unusual expression, Sal's attention sharpened. Jorge, a man in his late 30s, powerfully built with close-cropped black hair and a stern face, carried himself with an air of controlled menace. His dark eyes met Sal's, a subtle tension passing between them. Jorge's loyalty to Sal was absolute, his purpose to execute Moretti's will flawlessly, yet something in his posture, a slight stiffness that belied his usual imposing presence, signaled that this was no ordinary report. Sal's gaze, cold and assessing, fixed on his enforcer, waiting for the news that had clearly disrupted Jorge's usual stoic composure. The usual calm of the Serpent's sanctum was about to be disturbed, a ripple spreading from the streets into the heart of his domain. The heavy oak door of Sal's office creaked open, sound that usually preceded a report of a problem, a debt collected, or an enemy neutralized. But this time it revealed not one of Sal's usual contacts, but a small, drenched figure standing hesitantly on the threshold. Elena Petrova, her simple dress torn and muddied, her face a canvas of tears and grime, clutched her doll like a shield. The relentless rain still clung to her, turning the opulent office into an alien landscape. Sal's piercing blue eyes, accustomed to assessing threats and calculating risks, widened almost imperceptibly. This was not the face of an enemy, nor a petitioner seeking a business deal. This was pure, unadulterated desperation in the form of a child. Jorge El Matillo Rodriguez shifted his weight, his powerful frame tensing, ready to intervene, but Sal's sharp, almost imperceptible gesture stopped him. The old man, Nikolai Volkov, the consigliere, a gaunt figure in his early 70s with thinning white hair and deeply lined face, peered from behind a towering bookshelf. His sharp, intelligent gaze, usually focused on ancient ledgers and strategic maps, was now fixed on the child with a flicker of something unreadable, perhaps surprise, perhaps a distant memory stirred by her fragile presence. Nikolai represented the old ways, the rigid adherence to established hierarchies and rules, where sentiment was a liability. Yet the sight of this child, so utterly out of place and so clearly in distress, presented a new variable. Sal, who had built his empire on a foundation of ruthless efficiency and emotional detachment, felt an unfamiliar stir within him. The image of his own lost wife, Maria, a phantom from a past he desperately tried to bury, flickered behind his eyes. The child's wide, pleading brown eyes, so full of a fear he had sworn to eradicate from his own heart, mirrored a vulnerability he thought long dead. He saw not just a plea for help, but a reflection of a pain he had long suppressed, a pain that had fueled his transformation into the Serpent. This fragile messenger, sent by fate or circumstance into his inner sanctum, was about to force the ruthless boss to confront the very humanity he had spent decades trying to discard. The rain lashed against the grimy window panes of Sal Moretti's penthouse office, each drop a tiny hammer against the silence. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigar smoke, and something colder, something that clung to the dark mahogany and polished chrome. Salvatore Sal the Serpent Moretti, a man whose reputation preceded him like a chilling wind, sat at his imposing desk. His dark, slicked-back hair, streaked with distinguished gray at the temples, was perfectly in place, as was the sharp cut of his charcoal suit. His piercing blue eyes, cold and observant, scanned a ledger, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the whispers of the street, the growing unease within his organization. For years Sal had cultivated an image of ruthless efficiency, a man who never wavered, never showed a flicker of sentiment. The memory of Maria, his wife, lost years ago to a stray bullet meant for him, was a ghost he kept locked away, a wound he festered into a shield of absolute control. He believed vulnerability was a fatal flaw, a weakness that cost him everything. Yet a tremor had begun to ripple through the city's underbelly, a subtle shift in the established order that gnawed at him. A new kind of ruthlessness was emerging, one that disregarded the old codes, a chaos that threatened the very foundations of the empire he'd built with such brutal precision. He adjusted the heavy gold ring on his right hand, the sapphire catching the low light, a silent promise of the power he wielded. But even the Serpent felt the stirrings of a different kind of danger, not to his life, but to the carefully constructed fortress around his heart. He needed to reassert control, not just of his empire, but of the encroaching disorder that reminded him painfully of the vulnerability he swore to never feel again. He looked up as the door opened, not with a knock, but with a quiet click. His loyal enforcer, Jorge El Matillo Rodriguez, entering with the silent tread of a predator. Jorge, powerfully built, his face a mask of stern loyalty, stood at attention, awaiting his boss's word. Outside the polished confines of Sal Moretti's world, the city's underbelly wept. In a cramped, cold tenement apartment, 7-year-old Elena Petrova huddled by her mother's bedside. The air was thin, reeking of sickness and despair. Elena, small for her age, her dark, tangled hair falling across a tear-streaked face, clutched her mother's frail hand. Her simple, once clean dress was now torn and smudged with the grime of her frantic journey across town. Her mother's breathing was shallow, a faint rattle that sent waves of terror through the child. Aggressive debt collectors had made their demands clear. Payment was due, and if it wasn't met, They would take what little they had, and more. Elena had seen the fear in her mother's eyes, a fear that mirrored her own, a fear that grew with every rasping breath. She remembered the hushed conversations, the pleas for help that went unanswered, driven by a fierce love and a desperate need to save the only family she had. Elena had made a decision far beyond her years. She had overheard whispers, fragments of hushed conversations about a man known as the Serpent, a man of power, a man who could make problems disappear. Armed with nothing but her unwavering resolve and a tattered drawing of a flower she'd made for her mother, Elena slipped out into the rain-slicked street. Her small legs carried her through alleys, slick with refuse, past looming shadows that seemed to swallow the streetlights. The city, a labyrinth of harsh realities, was a terrifying beast, but the image of her mother's fading smile spurred her onward. She had to find Salvatore Moretti, had to make him understand, had to beg him to help. Her plea was simple: save her mother. Her hope, however, was a fragile, flickering flame against the crushing darkness of her circumstances. Jorge El Martillo Rodriguez stood before Sal Moretti, his posture a study in controlled respect. The sound of the rain outside had softened to a persistent drumming against the window, a low hum beneath the charged silence in the office. Sal's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, measured, yet carried the weight of absolute command. "Jorge," he began, the name rolling off his tongue like a judgment. "The streets are talking. Old rules are being bent, broken. We can't have that. It's untidy." He gestured vaguely with his left hand, his sapphire ring glinting. "There are elements encroaching, forgetting their place. This Petrova situation, I want it handled. Not swept under the rug, Jorge. Handled. The collectors, they need to understand that there are lines that can't be crossed, especially when it involves innocence." The last word was spoken with a barely perceptible roughness, a flicker of something Sal quickly masked. The memory of Maria, a memory he buried deep, resurfaced unbidden. He pushed it back with practiced ease. Ensure the family is protected, and these men, Sal's cold blue eyes narrowed, make them understand the cost of their transgression. No unnecessary brutality, Jorge, just firm instruction. Let them know who they're dealing with, and what happens when they forget. Jorge nodded, his dark eyes absorbing every nuance of Sal's command. He understood. This was more than just a debt collection. It was a message. It was Sal re-establishing his authority, not with a sledgehammer, but with a precisely aimed, crushing blow. Jorge's loyalty was absolute, and Sal's word was his law. He knew how to deliver firm instruction. He was El Martillo, the hammer. But for the first time, Sal's directive carried a subtle, almost imperceptible undertone, a whisper of something beyond pure strategy, a hint of a long-dormant protective instinct that even he couldn't fully comprehend. He trusted Jorge to execute his will, but he also knew Jorge possessed his own moral compass, one that Sal, in his current mood, was surprisingly willing to accommodate. The air in Salvatore, Sal the Serpent, Moretti's private office was thick, not just with the scent of aged leather and expensive cigar smoke, but with an almost palpable tension. Rain lashed against the tall, leaded windows, overlooking a rain-slicked, nocturnal cityscape. Each drop a tiny hammer blow against the glass, mirroring the relentless pressure Sal constantly navigated. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, a fortress of polished wood, his hands clasped loosely before him. The sapphire on his right hand glinted under the muted glow of a banker's lamp, a stark blue eye against the dark gold. His piercing blue gaze, usually sharp enough to cut diamonds, was fixed on the small, bedraggled figure standing just a few feet away. Elena Petrova, barely 7 years old. She was a tiny smudge of desperation against the opulent backdrop of Sal's empire. Her small frame trembled, her face a mask of dirt and tears, those wide, pleading brown eyes fixed on him with a hope that felt both fragile and impossibly bold. Sal's jaw was tight, a muscle ticking rhythmically. He saw not just a child, but a ghost, a flicker of the vulnerability he'd buried decades ago, after Maria, His wife was lost. Elena's mother, he'd been told by Jorge, was sick, and men he'd never sanctioned were using her debt as a weapon. This was an unacceptable breach of protocol, a sloppy, unsanctioned brutality that grated against the carefully constructed order of his world. He adjusted his silk tie, the movement precise, almost mechanical. Every instinct screamed at him to shut this child out, to dismiss her with the cold finality that had served him for so long. But Maria's ghost and the chilling echo of her screams wouldn't let him. He saw the raw, unvarnished fear in Elena's eyes, a mirror of what he'd felt that terrible night, and for the first time in years, the edifice of the Serpent began to crack. Outside the opulent confines of Sal's office, the city's underbelly hummed with a low, dangerous thrum. Rain continued its relentless assault, turning alleyways into glistening canyons and slicking the cobblestones with a treacherous sheen. Jorge El Martillo Rodriguez stood under the meager shelter of a fire escape, the collar of his practical dark jacket turned up against the downpour. His powerfully built frame seemed to absorb the gloom, his stern face set in grim lines, the permanent 5 o'clock shadow accentuating his steely resolve. He had received Sal's directive moments ago, a deviation from the usual hardline approach that made even Jorge pause: protect the Petrova family. Not eliminate them, not shake them down further, but protect them. The men who were pressuring them, men Sal never authorized, were operating outside the established lines, and that was a cancer Jorge was trained to cut out. His deep-set dark eyes scanned the narrow street, observing the shadows, listening to the rhythm of the rain. He carried himself with an air of controlled menace, the very embodiment of his nickname, the Hammer. He understood Sal's shift. The old ways, the strict unwritten codes, were being eroded by opportunists. This wasn't just about a sick woman and her child. It was about maintaining order, about reinforcing the boundaries that kept their empire from collapsing into chaos. He pulled his phone from his pocket, the screen a small beacon in the dim light, and began to make a series of calls, his voice a low, measured rumble that carried no hint of hesitation. Each number dialed, each hushed instruction given, was a precise strike, a hammer blow aimed at the offending elements. He would ensure Elena's mother was safe, and that the thugs who dared to operate under Sal's name without his explicit sanction would learn the true meaning of the hammer. Miles away, in an equally imposing but far more dated study, Nikolai Volkov, the consigliere, felt the ripple of Sal's unconventional decision. The scent of pipe tobacco, a stale, comforting aroma, hung heavy in the air of his dimly lit room, mingling with the faint mustiness of old books. He sat by a large window, watching the rain distort the view of manicured gardens, his gaunt frame draped in an expensive but slightly old-fashioned suit. His thinning white hair was neatly combed back, his deeply lined face a testament to decades of navigating the treacherous currents of organized crime. He held a polished wooden cane, his knuckles white as he tapped it lightly on the Persian rug. Sal was evolving, and while evolution could mean survival, it also carried inherent risks. Protecting a debt-ridden woman and her child, especially a child who had the audacity to walk into Sal's office alone, was not how the old ways operated. The honor Nikolai guarded, the strict hierarchy, and territorial agreements were being tested. He understood Sal's personal demons, the shadow of Maria, but sentiment was a luxury rarely afforded in their world. He picked up a heavy ledger, its pages filled with meticulous script, and began to trace the lines with a trembling finger. These were the records, the history, the unwritten laws that had kept families like the Morettis in power for generations. Sal's current path, while perhaps born of a flicker of humanity, could be interpreted as weakness by rivals and subordinates alike. Nikolai knew he would have to speak with Sal, to remind him of the delicate balance, to ensure that this act of perceived compassion did not unravel the very foundation Sal had so ruthlessly built. The city's underworld was a complex ecosystem, and a single misstep, however well-intentioned, could trigger a cascade of unforeseen consequences.